Hi, and welcome to Bloody Good Reads. I'm your host, Mike Goddard, and this week's guest is an author of horror, bizarro, and a bit of science fiction as well. He is a splatterpunk and Wonderland Book Award nominated author with 8 books under his belt so far, and a brand new book coming out in September. Love a bit of vampires and Nazis. It's the last night to kill Nazis. Welcome to the podcast, David Agranoff.
Hey, you said it correctly.
I
Thank
did.
you, Mark.
I paused slightly because I almost said it wrong. There you go.
Yeah, it's excellent to be on your podcast. I'm very excited to have this conversation. You are the first person I am talking to last night to kill Nazis with, so that's exciting.
I've been starting to read it, but the people who listen to this podcast know I do too many episodes to read full books anymore. So, but the first few chapters are amazing. But we'll go into that later on in the podcast.
Mm-hmm.
But what we'd like to do on the podcast is force authors to pick 3 books they love because I am a bastard. But before we get to that point, and before we get into the brand new book, what we like to ask every guest is, how did you get into the horror genre?
Oh, well, so in the United States, and I'm old enough, I'm coming up on half a century, that when I was a kid, one of the kind of mainstays of American culture was horror hosts, right? So, and I grew up in Indiana, which is a Midwestern state, kind of just east of Chicago. And in Indiana, we had every Friday night we had a horror host named Sammy Terry, who wore like a purple cape and green makeup and talked to a spider on a string, and he would introduce horror movies every Friday night at 11:30. And afterwards, Channel 4 would show what they called black belt theater, which was like all like so it would be like Hammer movies during Sammy Terry and Shaw Brothers movies during black belt theater. And I used to just, because I couldn't always stay awake, I just push record on our VCR. And so I had all these amazing double features of like Sammy Terry and Black Belt Theater, which actually inspired my first novel, Hunting the Moon Tribe, which was Chinese vampires. And, so you can see obviously where that one came from. and, but Sammy Terry, all the horror folks in my home state of Indiana and most of like the punk rockers and like alternative people, like Friday nights and watching Sammy Terry was a big, big deal. And his son actually is carrying on the Sammy Terry legend and is like still like doing Sammy Terry at events and hosting movies online and like watch parties dressed as Sammy Terry. So, his son is keeping Sammy Terry alive. And, I've got a Sammy Terry shirt that I rock every once in a while because he was huge for getting me into horror. But I was always a science fiction kid, and science fiction is probably my big love. And I started reading Isaac Asimov when I was too young to read it myself. My mom wasn't a science fiction reader, but she would sit at my bedside and started reading me the Lucky Star books, which are like kind of the YA Isaac Asimov books from the 50s. And eventually I transitioned into reading them on my own by the time I read all 7 of those. And I know Stephen King has referenced those books before, so I'm not the only one that was influenced by those. But and I was a big Asimov person, but when I was 12 years old, my mom passed away, and I was a mama's boy. And the combination of Sammy Terry and going through that like kind of loss, I discovered Stephen King right before I was in 8th grade. And Stephen King and Clive Barker, when I was in 8th grade, I should not have been reading Clive Barker in 8th grade. But when a lot of other kids were trading baseball cards and football cards and all that, like I was going to school, and I still have my copy of The Stand that I hand wrote, "Don't forget social studies report," like inside my copy of The Stand. And I was just a voracious reader for all things horror as early as 8th grade. And I loved Richard Matheson, Stephen King, Clive Barker, but Matheson and Barker were my absolute favorites when I was a kid.
Very good choices.
Yeah. Well, I Am Legend was, a game changer. And one of the reasons I credit Richard Matheson for teaching me what a writer is, because I was also a big Twilight Zone kid. And it was going to the used bookstore and seeing the name Richard Matheson on the spine of a book because I knew his name from Star Trek and the Twilight Zone. And I was like, hey, I know that name. And so I bought three Three Steps from the Sun. I think this is the name of the collection. I still have that copy on my shelf. And I Am Legend, the 70s copy, and brought it home from Caveat Emptor, which is a used bookstore in my hometown. And those books were like foundational, for me. And combining science fiction and horror, and I think early in my writing career, I was very focused on horror, and I'll always write horror. I will always love horror, but I am kind of transitioning to writing more science fiction and, well, weird stuff. But yeah, at the same time, I'm releasing a horror novel right now, and horror is one of my great loves of all time. So I will always write horror in some way, shape, or form.
It's nice to have a kind of a mix as well, though. Having a mix of genres that you can kind of flip between. It can get quite boring writing the same stuff. So kind of jump between
Yeah.
sci-fi, jump to a bit of horror, jump to a bit of bizarro, that kind of thing.
Well, and horror is a genre I love to read, but science fiction and the history of science fiction is a huge passion of mine. And in fact, I just finished my first nonfiction book that's in part, well, it's about Phillip K. Dick, but and Phil is one of my absolute favorite writers on the planet, so to have ever existed. And also one of my absolute favorite science fiction writers is a Brit as well, and that's John Brunner, who and if people don't know, John Brunner wrote one of the greatest science fiction horror crossover novels in The Sheep Look Up. And I know John Skip and I had talked endlessly, and I had John Skip on my Dickheads podcast to talk about The Sheep Look Up because it is one of the most horrifying novels that was ever written, and I consider it a top 3 horror novel as well as science fiction novel. So I'll put the shout out for Britain's own John Brunner on that one.
So where did the idea for the Dickheads podcast come around? Because of your love of Philip K. Dick.
Well, actually, one of our original co-hosts and my co-author, Anthony Trevino, we just wrote a sci-fi horror novel last year that came out last year from Grand Mall Press called Nightmare City. And Anthony and I, while we were working on Nightmare City, Anthony had the idea that he wanted to read all the Philip K. Dick novels in publication order because one of Phil's novels is, and I don't want to give it away entirely because it's going to be one of my 3 books, but
segue.
Yeah, so I'll save that one, but is one of Anthony's favorites, and he decided he wanted to read all of Phil's work from beginning to end. And he was about 5 novels in and was looking for, he was like, well, there's got to be a Philip K. Dick podcast called Dickheads. And he was shocked to find there wasn't one. And he tried to loop our friend Larry and I into, he was like, we should do this. And it's funny because as anyone who listens to the podcast knows, Anthony became the least passionate person about the podcast. Because one of the things that Anthony discovered was that he didn't like Phil's work as much as he thought he did when he started.
That's a bad way of starting.
Yeah. Well, he still likes Phil's work, but he'll tell you he was very over it by the time we got to Phil's work in the 80s. And so Anthony is actually not finishing out the podcast, and Professor D. Harlan Wilson of Wright State University, and who just wrote a biography of J.G. Ballard a couple of years ago, is finishing out the podcast in the 3rd chair. And we're really excited to have him involved. Anthony got the ball rolling, and did probably 80% of the podcast. So, shout out to Anthony. he gutted it out for a long time. Uh, but one of the things about doing the podcast was, in the beginning, I had said that I didn't need another project and I just want to read the books. But the truth of the matter is that my father is a researcher. He was a political scientist, and I love doing research and I love the history of science fiction. So I ended up becoming like, it ended up taking over a lot of my time and energy doing the research. And getting into the history of science fiction became very, very, very interesting to me. And for your readers, or your listeners, excuse me, um, Phil is very horrific and has written plenty of horror, and a lot of his science fiction is very horrific. So he kind of blurs the lines a little bit there. I mean, just take a look at Scanner Darkly, for example. Which is one of his masterpieces, and quite horrific. And of course, Screamers. If you've ever seen the movie Screamers, which is based on Phil's masterpiece novella Second Variety, it is definitely a work of science fiction horror. So Phil kind of fills both of that for me, no pun intended. But yeah, that was the idea of doing Dickheads, and it's been really fun. And I now know Phil's work to a level of, that scene in A Beautiful Mind when he starts seeing the equations floating around his head. That's how I read Philip K. Dick's books now. And part of it is that in 1965, he wrote a 5-page letter to a friend explaining his formula for writing novels. And I straight up murder boarded 27 of the novels based on the formula. And now I see the formula on almost every page of his books when I read them now. And in that sense, he's becoming way more of an influence on the future fiction than I, and actually the next novel I'm going to attempt to write, I'm actually going to try to use his formula and as an experiment, and not write the book as David Agranoff, but write the book, not as Phil, because I'm not that full of myself, but using the formula and trying to write in another voice, and like kind of imagining in my head that, I'm looking at it as my favorite year of his production was 1963. And I'm kind of picturing it as, what if Philip K. Dick time traveled from 1963 to our time and was commenting on our modern world. So we'll see if that experiment works. But
if you don't use the name Dick Phillips, I'll be very disappointed.
Well, he used a bunch of names jokingly. He wrote a nasty book review of his own book under the name Chip Dip K Dill or something like that. So I've thought about that, but at the same time, I think that's being a little presumptuous. But he also, made himself a character in Valis under the name Horse Lover Fat, which is, so some people have suggested that I should write it as Horse Lover Fat because, Philip Jose Farmer, for example, wrote a novel in the style of Kurt Vonnegut under the name Kilgore Trout, which was a fictional author in Kurt Vonnegut's work. And I just don't know if I have the hubris to do that.
Well, let's segue into it then. So, again, what we like to do here in the podcast is force authors to pick 3 books they love. So what is your first book that you brought along today?
That would be Wet Bones by John Shirley.
Okay.
I consider it to be my favorite horror novel ever written. And now John's a mentor of mine, and he and I have written a screenplay together. He's an International Horror Guild, Bram Stoker award-winning legend. His most famous work is probably The Crow, the movie The Crow, which he co-wrote with David J. Scow. And John's actually the one who originated the project of the film of The Crow. So that's why he doesn't complain every time they reboot it or remake it, because you know, he gets paid. So,
Hmm.
um, but John, if people don't know, John has a full career of writing science fiction and a full career of writing horror, and that's one of the reasons why he's one of my big influences and one of my favorite authors, is because he's done exactly what I would like to do, which is have a full catalog of horror novels and a full catalog of science fiction novels. And I consider him to have a masterpiece in both. He has a science fiction masterpiece called City Come a Walkin', which is like one of the, which William Gibson has called Cyberpunk Patient Zero. And if William Gibson calls it that, I'm not going to argue with him. But Wet Bones is, John's been very upfront. He was trying to get clean from a heroin addiction at the time when he wrote Wet Bones. And Wet Bones is a very angry horror novel about the power and horror of addiction. And it's Lovecraftian, it's Cronenbergian. It makes fun of Hollywood to a degree, so it has a little bit of like kind of eyes wide shut like Hollywood cult thing. And it has the anger of like a punk rock song, or like a metal song, but it's and I consider it to be I think the best horror novel ever written, in my personal opinion. So it's my number one horror novel. So that would be the first book I pick, Wet Bones by John Shirley.
Awesome. And quite a good price at the moment, actually. It's only 4.90 over here in the UK on paperback. So
Yeah,
if you don't go and get it now, it's ridiculous that you haven't got it. So go and get it now.
yeah, it's a good one. It's a good one, and John is a great short story writer, and he won the Bram Stoker Award for his collection Black Butterflies. And that contains the story Rubber Smile, which is the one that John and I wrote a screenplay for, adapted into a screenplay. So I recommend that one too.
Okay,
But
cool.
that's my number one.
Cool. Right. Let's get into your own work. So, when did the kind of urge to want to be a writer yourself come about? And where did the idea was it hunting the moon tribe first? Was it the vegan revolution with zombies that came first?
Well, I wrote Hunting the Moon Tribe first, but Vegan Revolution with Zombies came out first. So uh, technically, Moon Tribe was the first attempt at writing a novel that a serious attempt at writing a novel. I had been trying to write fiction um, basically since I was a little kid, since I was dictating ridiculous. I had a ridiculous science fiction detective story series that I was dictating to my mother when I couldn't even type. I can't even imagine how ridiculous it was, but so I've always wanted to create and always wanted to write. The thing that stopped me, two things stopped me for many years. One is which is that I'm extremely dyslexic, and early in my young adulthood, I was too embarrassed to put my fiction out there because my grammar was terrible. And so really, honestly, I started by screenwriting. And so the very first major writing project I did was I wrote a screenplay of Hunting the Moon Tribe. And this was right around the time that Crouching Tiger, Hidden Drag,
Hmm.
Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon was the biggest, surprise movie of the
Yeah.
year, and so writing a novel that I could pitch as Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dracula seemed like a good idea. And so I originally wrote it as a screenplay, and it actually placed in a bunch of amateur screenplay contests, including the Nickel Fellowship, which is an amateur screenwriting contest put on by the Oscars. And not it became a quarterfinalist in the Nickel, which has launched careers. That's how Andrew Walker Card originally sold Seven, was placing in the Nickel, not winning, but placing in the quarterfinals. And that's how he got the attention to get Seven. And believe me, I had production companies and a few people like reaching out to me for that screenplay at the time, but the thing was, it was an all Chinese cast with a giant effects budget at a time when, you know, even though Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon was a huge hit, it just was a daunting thing. So eventually, I decided that I was going to turn it into a novel, and I just started writing short stories and things to try and get better and teach myself better grammar. And I'm still a little grammar challenged and give editors a lot of hard work, but at the same time, I've gotten a lot better. So just by force of habit and just continuing to write and continuing to write, and there's a lot of dyslexic authors out there. Believe me, I've found that out by basically coming out and talking about it. But yeah, Moon Tribe was the first attempt at a novel, and the first book that I released was a short story collection called Screams from a Dying World. And that's how I kind of got involved with the Bizarro scene, is that somewhere online I met Karen and Gina from Afterbirth Books. Um, and they expressed interest because they were vegan and environmentalists, and they knew that my collection was vegan and environmentally themed. And so, because that's the theme of Screams from a Dying World, is environmental horror stories and science fiction and horror. And so they expressed interest in publishing that. They published that. And how I got involved with Eraserhead and the whole Bizarro community is first off, I moved to Portland, which is kind of ground zero for that stuff. And I was in Portland, and there was a gathering of writers, just like a night where everybody was hanging out. And part of the thing of the night was everybody was reading flash fiction. And I read a flash fiction piece that I did about a serial killer gnome, that was an intentionally funny piece. And one of the people that I saw really in the audience really laughing and like giving me a lot of props for it was Carlton Mellick III, of course,
Mm-hmm.
the author of The Haunted Vagina and
Many others.
many others. And Carlton afterwards came up and told me that he really liked the story. And about a week later, he called me up, and he's, knowing that I was vegan, he said, and the conversation literally went like this: David, vegan books sell, zombie books sell. You should write a vegan themed zombie novel. And as a horror writer who took themselves very seriously, I thought this was the worst idea in the world. And then I told him that I didn't, and he's like, well, but I heard your story and it was very funny, and I know you can write humor. You should think about it. And if you write this book, we'll give you a 5-book deal, and the other 4 we can just work out later.
Okay.
And so I was like, okay, give me 2 weeks. And the whole idea for the vegan revolution with zombies was hashed over the next 2 weeks. And then when I eventually pitched them the idea, Carlton and Rose loved it. And then I had a meeting with Rose and Carl, and I pitched 10 books to them. And basically, they, like Carlton and Rose, started picking out the ones that they wanted. And the first of which was Boot Boys of the Wolf Reich, which was Nazi skinheads and neo-Nazi skinheads and werewolves in late 80s Chicago skinhead scene. And basically it's my version of a coming of age novel with skinheads and werewolves. And but Carlton was immediately drawn to, like, he just seen the title Boot Boys of the Wolf Reich. He was like, tell me about this one.
It definitely sounds like something he would go for.
Yeah. And so they were very excited about that. And I, convinced them to do Hunting the Moon Tribe in there. And we did, a couple books. Punk Rock Ghost Story was in there, which is a really interesting story in itself. But And then Ring of Fire, which is my environmental apocalypse novel. And so, I did a couple books there
Mm.
with Deadite. At the time, Jeff Burke was the editor of Deadite, and Jeff and I had a really wonderful working relationship, and um, just got along really well. And specifically working together on Ring of Fire and Punk Rock Ghost Story was really great because Jeff got a lot of the things that I wanted to do, because especially with Punk Rock Ghost Story, I threw at him a very daunting thing, which was, Punk Rock Ghost Story didn't come out till 2017, 2018, and I first pitched it to him in 2011.
Okay.
And I said, I want to write. Um, I basically pitched it as The Shining, but instead of a hotel, it's a punk rock tour van.
Okay.
And I said, I need 7 years to do this book. And he kind of looked at me and he was like, "Why do you need 7 years?" And I said, "Because I want to convince the world that the band that's in the book was a real band."
Mm.
And so one of the two fictional bands in the book, the original owners of the punk rock tour van, was this fake band called the Fuckers, who were going to be a punk rock band out of my home state of Indiana. And the idea was is that their singer killed a bunch of people, and then the rest of the band had to kill him on tour, and now he haunts the van. But in order to convince people that the band was real, I needed time to record the record, which my buddy in England, my buddy Rat, who's a longtime punk rocker and musician, and for years he's done a musical project called Statement, where he plays all the guitars, drums, bass, and records the vocals himself. And so basically, Rat recorded all the music, and I said, make this sound like an American punk band from 1982, and um, and then I did all the vocals. And we pressed the record. We did a documentary that has all these famous or well-known punk rockers from Indiana talking about the band like they were real. And we talked about the murder and the violence that happened on the tour that's in the story as if it had been a real thing, and
Mm.
that I was finishing the story. And you know, when you see YouTube comments on the video and people are like, "Oh yeah, I saw that band. I saw them in so and so's basement in '82." It's really rewarding when people think it's real. But we spent years building the mythology of the Fuckers up in order
Mm.
to do the release of, and I gave it away at the end of Punk Rock Ghost Story. We have a whole section where we show all the different things we did to fool people. And I did have a journalist, shout out to Jonathan Sanders, who was writing for Nuvo, which is the entertainment newspaper in Indianapolis, my home state of Indiana, who wrote an article, and he didn't finish reading the book. So he wrote the article like the band had been real. And, I keep telling Jonathan that if he had finished the book, then it wouldn't have happened to him. But we're friends, and it's to this day, and he admits that he got by the whole thing. And so we had a lot of fun doing that book, and so that book is called Punk Rock Ghost Story, still available from Deadeye Press. And if you search on YouTube, if you put in Fuckers Punk Rock Mystery, the documentary is up there, and you can see how good our acting is, because some people's acting was better than others. But I think
Mm.
everybody did a pretty great job, because it has fooled people. Although every once in a while you'll see comments on YouTube where people say, this is bullshit. This isn't a real band. And
Mhm.
usually I reply, you're not a real band, but whatever. Uh,
That's a good way of marketing it, though. That's an amazing marketing ploy.
yeah. Well,
7 years of.
it's still working too, because people
Yeah.
still find it, and it's part of my kind of punk rock trilogy, which is my unofficial punk rock trilogy, which is Boot Boys of the Wolf Reich, Punk Rock Ghost Story, and then I did a short story collection called Amazing Punk Stories, which
Mm.
um, uh, Jeff and I did for Eraserhead, and that is all pulp fiction style stories. There's a western story, sci-fi story, space opera story, like and 7 horror stories, all with punk rock characters and settings, and with a introduction by John Shirley, author of Wet Bones. So and I'm really proud of that book. And one of the stories, which is called Puncupine Moshers of the Apocalypse, was in the Best Bizarro Fiction of the Decade anthology edited by Cameron Pierce alongside Joe R. Lansdale and a bunch of other authors. That So I'm really proud of that story appearing in there.
Cool.
but but yeah, it's that one. I'm pretty proud of, or all 3 of those. Yeah.
Awesome. So before we get into your brand new book, which is The Last Night to Kill Nazis, but let's go to your second book choice. So what is your second bloody good read that you brought along today?
That would be The Three Stigmata of Palmer Eldridge by Philip K. Dick, which I consider to be Phil's masterpiece
Mm.
of science fiction and horror. It is one of the most horrific books. Well, it's the most horrific book he wrote,
Mm.
for sure, and it's one of the most horrific and weird fiction books of all time. It is one of his weirdest books. It is, you know how like when people see like Mulholland Drive or like a good David Lynch movie, a lot of times the first time you watch it, you're just your mind's so blown you can't really take it. and
Mm.
and then when you go back, like Mulholland Drive's a movie that if you go back and watch it, once you figure out what it's about, you feel stupid that you didn't see it the first time.
Mm.
Three Stigmata is like that. It's such a weird book that it's very easy to be like, what the hell is going on? This is totally insane. It's a completely bizarro book, but I've now read it 3 times. um, and it is just a masterpiece work of science fiction and horror. He wrote it in 1963. It was inspired by, and this is topical since Barbie is one of the biggest movies in the world right now. It was
Mm-hmm.
inspired by watching his daughters play with Ken and Barbies. And the basic concept is that in this future, Earth has gotten so unlivable with heat. Which, wow, how does that doesn't sound relevant at all, right?
Oh yeah, know that feeling.
The Earth has become so unlivable with heat that people are starting to colonize Mars,
Mm.
and this is before they knew how much radiation there is in Mars. But living on Mars basically sucks too. So um, because it's like just the beginning stages of this colonization effort, that people are being drafted and forced to go to Mars, and one of the ways they live on Mars and handle like how terrible it is they live in these what are called virtual reality layouts. They're called PP layouts, which you live in this virtual reality. And the most famous one is Perky Pat, who's kind of like the Barbie stand-in.
Mm.
And everybody wants to live in like the Perky Pat layouts. And so the main character works for the company who creates these Barbie like Perky Pat layouts, and everything's going great for their company until this famous rich guy who left the solar system, Palmer Eldridge, returns from Proxima Centauri, and he has this drug called Chu Z, which is supposed to free your mind into eternal life. And once people start taking the Chu Z, really freaky things start happening. And I'm not going to say anything else, but the Three Stigmata of Palmer Eldridge is one of the most bizarro, insane, crazy, bloody good reads. So I think horror readers should read the Three Stigmata of Palmer Eldritch for my number two.
Awesome choice. Awesome choice. It's nice to have some different choices. That's not Stephen King. So
Yeah. I will not
I
pick Stephen King, even though I love Uncle Steve's first couple books. I'm not a Stephen King super fan. So
most people are.
most people are.
Anyway,
I'm a 40-60 guy. I think 40%
yeah,
of his work is genius, and a lot of it is unreadable. And
mm,
it's not. And part of it is I'm a structure guy, and Stephen King writes from the seat of his pants, right?
mm-hmm.
And so a book like Under the Dome to me is just unforgivable. Um, and listen, I got all the respect in the world for Stephen King, and he's said he knows that not everybody's cup of tea is his work, and there he and his son are who I love Joe Hill's work, and I like Joe, but they are militantly anti-outlining and structure, and I am
Mm.
militantly evangelical about structure and outlining. So I am the direct opposite.
Awesome.
But
No.
just for a counter opinion, because that you won't. Now I know a lot of people won't say that. That being said, for example,
Mhm.
like Later, the hard case crime novel that King put out a couple years ago,
Mm.
is absolutely brilliant. I fucking love Later. I think it's great.
Cool.
So I'm not anti Stephen King. I'm actually very pro Stephen King. I just
I am not anti. I know it does come across that way sometimes. I'm almost 100 episodes.
I'm a
Almost,
huge
look,
Robert
I'm
McCandon stand too.
yeah.
So
Look,
yeah,
I'm 100. I'm almost 100 episodes in, and he's one of my most picked authors. So. There you go.
yeah,
Awesome. So two amazing picks so far. So before we get to your last pick, let's get into your brand new book. So
yep.
coming out from Clash Books, who have been putting out some absolute bangers as of late. The Last Night to Kill Nazis. Where did the idea of this one come about? Because it's quite a. I like vampires. I like Nazi horror, which is a weird thing to say, but stuff like Dead Snow was amazing,
Yeah.
in that kind of era. So I also love vampires, so it's a great mix. So where did the idea for this one come about?
This one came to me like a lightning bolt, like much like my horror novel Ring of Fire is one I thought about for 15 years,
Hmm.
right? And it took me 15 years to go from idea to, well, 13 years. Idea to completed novel because it took a lot of research and so on and so forth. This is the opposite. This is the quickest from idea to completed novel that I've ever had. Probably about 2.5 months from idea. It just happened to be that I was between projects, um, and I was ready for it. And it all started with a conversation with. So I have a buddy, Evan Zorek, who's a writer, a really great writer out of Portland, and he and I are big, massive basketball nerds. And our team is the Portland Trailblazers, which means nothing to people who are not basketball people. But whenever the Blazers play a game, like Even and I are up late, like a lot of times, like breaking down the game, talking online. And I don't remember how the conversation turned to we were talking about some movie and he was like, yeah, it's just some he's like it's basic oh it was the German movie with the hostage taking situation that was on
Oh,
Netflix.
I know which one you mean. That's been,
Yeah, and he
yeah,
said
yeah.
it's a hijack movie with a vampire.
Mm.
And and then he said, any movie can be made better with a vampire, right? And I kind of laughed at that, and I wasn't thinking much of it. But then, like a half an hour later, I was sitting in my chair and I was just thinking, like, well, yeah, every movie is kind of better, or you could make every movie better if you just added a vampire. Well, what? And one of the things is that I love World War II mission movies. Love them. Force 10 from Navarone, Guns from Navarone, uh, The Dirty Dozen, like all these movies. I love them. I love World War II mission novels. It's just a thing. My dad and I watched them together. And so then I thought, well, what would be a World War II mission novel with a vampire? And then the main character, Noah Sonovich, who's a Jewish OSS, spy who, is all over Europe through, like, I had in my head, I just immediately pictured him answering the phone and then somebody saying to him, Hitler shot himself. We have to go now. They're going to surrender any minute now. Goebbels is already writing the surrender. We have to go. We have to kill as many Nazis as we can before they surrender.
Mm.
And then I thought, he hangs up the phone and says, I got to go get my vampire. And the title, The Last Night to Kill Nazis, the whole thing. And I had done a World War II Men on a Mission tribute novel with Clash Books before. And that's my science fiction novel, Goddamn Killing Machines, which is basically Dirty Dozen if Phillip K. Dick wrote it. And so I had a relationship with Christoph and Lisa, and they're both from Jewish families. And so it was really important to me to publish this with somebody who's connected to the tribe, basically. And because my father was very Jewish, and I had just buried my father recently before that, and gone through all the Jewish rituals for his funeral and everything. So like connection to the Jewish half of my culture was like really strong in my mind at that moment. And the novel, I started to research the novel, but really where the novel came together was I had the title, I had everything, but then I started to outline and I thought, well, this really isn't going to work. This really doesn't work if I didn't have a character who could be the Nazi POV
Mm.
character. And there's nobody to root for on the Nazi side, right?
Mm-hmm.
But then as I was doing research one night, I was watching this documentary on YouTube that was about like the last days of the war. And somebody, because I knew that I had to do a lot of research on that exact day because it was taking place on a very specific day. So the history is all there, right?
Yeah.
And I had to get a lot of the history right. And because that's very important to me. And so I was doing all this research and I watched this video, and there was this woman who had been Hitler's secretary, and she was in her 80s, in the 80s at the time when they interviewed her. And she started talking about how Hitler was just misunderstood and how he was really a great guy and people just misunderstood the Fuhrer. And my jaw dropped watching this lady. I was like, the disconnect and whatever. And then the character of Alice came to my head, who is one of the main characters in the novel, who is one of Hitler's secretaries, who's pregnant with an SS officer's baby from an affair that she was having inside the bunker. Because Hitler was in the bunker for like the last 3 months of his life, right?
Mm.
And he had a full staff down there and everything. So Alice became this character, and once I had Alice as a character, the whole book just came together. I'm a structure person in writing, and I like to have like kind of a give and go between characters and have like a certain rhythm and pace between like point of views and switching of point of views. And part of the story is this is a race, because in the novel the 150 SS officers are trying to escape to Manchuria, and they've got a landing strip up in the mountains by Hitler's, mountain home, which is the only thing I added to the history. Is there was no room for an airstrip up there,
Mm,
but I
yeah.
needed that for the story. But besides that, everything that happens, this could have been real history. It matches up with the real history, the timeline. I just added Noah and a vampire.
Mm,
But if you read through to the end, you will see that down to Himmler's death, everything is exactly accurate towards the history of, because Himmler is obviously one of the worst Nazis, and I wanted, um, and he is a key character in the novel, in the attempt for the escape. So, and here's the other thing too: is yes, I could have made this a lot of like fun, like just like a vampire ripping Nazis apart, but
mm,
this novel is very much about the trauma and guilt of the Holocaust. And our vampire account writer, he is very much, you know, by manipulating the Nazis and getting into their minds, he sees an angle to the Holocaust that I think really is a special part of the book.
mm-hmm.
It's something that I'm really proud of. And um, Alice's arc in the novel is probably one of the things that I am most proud of. And I think that people should, really key into, because uh, I put a lot of energy into that. And there's one moment, I don't want to give it away, but there's one turning point for Alice that was not something I had planned. It's just something that came up in the spur of the moment when I was writing. Which, by the way, to people like Stephen King, that still happens when you write from an outline. Because I know a lot of people who don't believe in outlines, they think that you don't ever have these moments when you're writing, but they
Mm.
do happen. And
Hmm.
Alice's arc in the book is really something I'm proud of. Yeah,
That is the one thing I kind of got from reading the first few chapters. It's not just shitting all over them, which a lot of people would do in this situation, in the Charles Band style of way, just kill
yeah.
them all and that kind of thing. It's there's pure emotion in this, and it's not just hate the Nazis. There's seeing it from that point of their view of what they must see is happening. Because a
Yeah.
lot of people there, they're blindly following him, even though they're starting to realize, okay, we've lost now, and that puts that extra little layer in it, which is why which would kept me reading, and I quite like that kind of that human feel to it.
Well, thank you, and I appreciate that, because you need to humanize. You need to humanize your villains, otherwise, it's just what are we doing here?
It's just a
And
Friday the 13th movie after that.
yeah, and
Yeah.
and part of the thing that the other thing I'm really proud of, and I think if you're a fan of movies like The Dirty Dozen or Guns and Navarone, or if you're a fan of those Alistair MacLean novels, there's also an extra level for this novel, because I had to do all the cliche moments, but
Mm-hmm.
do the vampire horror version of them. You
Mm.
have to have your double agent. You have to have your the first person that's killed on the mission. You have to have the turnabout. You have to have the part where everything moves up quicker, because like the timeline moves, and you have to have all these moments. Those are all key parts of this genre. And so fitting them into the structure of this novel was one of the things that was really fun. And on I had to have it happen in real time. I had to know, like, this starts with a phone call on April 30th at 4 in the morning, like, when the Allies find out that Hitler shot himself, and everything has to happen before Goebbels puts in the surrender, right?
Mm.
And so the race and the timeline, and when the Nazis are trying to fly out, and like everything was like, it was a realistic timeline. And the author who is absolutely best at that is actually my number 3 pick for my bloody good read. So how about that for a segue?
There we go. We'll segue straight into it then. So very, very quick. That is The Last Night to Kill Nazis. That is out in September. So by the time this podcast comes out, it should be coming out very soon.
Yeah, you can order it now. And I do want to say that if people want a signed copy, they can order from. There's a bookstore in here in San Diego called Mysterious Galaxies. And in September 14th, I'm doing a book signing at Mysterious Galaxies, and you can order through their website and even get personalized signatures. So if anyone wants to order a signed copy, they can do that through Mysterious Galaxies. So you can just Google Mysterious Galaxies San Diego, and they'll have a page for our event specifically. And you can, and also Cody Goodfellow will be signing at that with his new novel Vertical. So, so that's a great way to get the book too if you want a signed copy.
Awesome. And we'll put the link in the description below. If I get words out today.
Yeah.
Awesome. So let's segue into it. What is your third and final bloody good read?
That would be The Keep by F. Paul Wilson. Obviously, The Keep is a huge influence on this novel. It is a World War II. It's a novel that takes place in the same era, and you might think that it's also a vampire novel set in this era, but that's what F. Paul Wilson wants you to think. Paul is one of my favorite writers. I've taken classes from Paul. I have an interview up on my blog or on my podcast, my personal podcast, Postcards from a Dying World, where I interviewed Paul about writing outlines. So I highly recommend that. But this is Paul's masterpiece from the early 80s. It was made into a very terrible movie by Michael Mann. Ignore the movie. Read the book. It is book 1 of the Adversary Cycle series of 6 books, but it is also the first book in a saga that connects to the 15th book in the Repairman Jack series, Night World. So it kicks off the story that is a saga through 2 series that F. Paul Wilson wrote, the Adversary Cycle and the Repairman Jack books. And Adversary Cycle book 6 is also Repairman Jack book 15. I know that's confusing, but imagine 2 train tracks that come together. These stories come together. And The Keep is one of the greatest horror novels ever written. It is, and it's a masterclass in author misdirection. One of the things I'm sorry, I'm so used to talking about Phillip K Dick. One of the things that Paul does is he's a master of misdirection. He loves to make you think you're reading one novel and you're not. You're reading another one. He does it all the time, and he's super freaking good at it. And I'm jealous of his ability to do that. And Dr. Wilson is a really awesome person. He recently suffered a stroke and he's coming back from it. So I really want people to support his work, get out there and buy his work. He has, decades worth of books. And once you get started reading those Repairman Jack books, I know it's daunting because there's 15 books in the series, but book 10 has one of the greatest twists I've ever read in a story. It's one of the greatest twists in the hero's journey, but you got to get to book 10 to get to that twist. And that whole Secret History of the World saga, it's as unifying of a storyline as Dark Tower is for Stephen King's work, but through all of F. Paul Wilson's work, and it all kicks off with The Keep. That being said, you can read The Keep by itself and not read the rest. It stands alone. And The Keep, I would be a lying bastard if I didn't say that The Keep was not an enormous influence on this novel, to the point that I sent Dr. Wilson an email when I was starting to write this book and told him, hey, this this book's going to look a lot familiar.
Mhm.
And there's Easter eggs for the keep inside The Last Night to Kill Nazis, but I'm not giving those away. You have to look for them. There's two or three uh, F. Paul Wilson Easter eggs.
Awesome pick. So, what do you have coming up next? Are you taking a slight break from this, or are you now working on something new?
Well, I already mentioned Nightmare City. I
Yeah.
do want to mention Nightmare City, which is the book that I wrote with Anthony Trevino, and I think your readers will really enjoy Nightmare City too. We conceived of Nightmare City to be the HBO TV show The Wire. We kind of see Nightmare City as The Wire if Phillip K. Dick and Clive Barker were on the writing staff.
Hmm.
Um, and so it's like urban fantasy, horror, crime, sci-fi. Like, um, I really wanted it to, in the best case scenario would be to do like an X Files, ongoing series of these novels that are set in this near future Seattle that are, there's some mythology stories, there's some monster of the week. And so we kind of set that up with that book, Nightmare City. Um, and so I would hope people would check that one out too, because I think your readers or your listeners will really enjoy that one. But the next thing, I just finished a nonfiction book called Unfinished PKD, which is when Phil died, he left a lot of papers to, especially Cal State Fullerton, UC Riverside has some, but a lot of these archives are in my neighborhood because he was living an hour and a half away from me when he died in Santa Ana, Southern California. And so when he died, he left a lot of unfinished outlines and novels he started and never finished. And so my book, Unfinished PKD, is 100,000 words of breakdown and analysis of how Phil wrote books and how he conceived them. There's a chapter on his classic Ubik novel, which started as a completely different novel, and he outlined a completely different novel. So we look at how he started one novel and ended up with another, and then and so I've just finished this, so I'm still shopping for publishers, but I'm really proud of that. It's my first nonfiction book, and that I could have written 4 novels in the time it took me to write that. But the next novel to come out next March from Choir Books is I wrote a novel called People's Park, which is very influenced by Philip K. Dick, and I've been kind of describing it as Stranger Things with punk rock and skateboards and a whole bunch of what the fuck is real. It's one of my weirdest books, but it's also very autobiographical about my hometown, and it's a love letter to freaks and weirdos.
Perfect. That's what we're all on this podcast.
Yeah. Well,
Awesome.
People's Park, that's going to be, it's kind of supposed to be my transition between um, writing punk horror, because it is kind of punk horror coming of age,
Mm,
and sci-fi. But you'll kind of have to read it to see where that comes into it. And
yeah.
then I'm going to be working soon on that book based on the PKD formula. So that'll be the next one I write. And Choir has already expressed interest in publishing that. So I think as long as I can pull it off, that'll have a home too.
Awesome. A huge thank you to David for coming to the podcast this week.
No,
Where can
thank you for having me. This is great. This is the first of many podcasts where I get to talk about Last Night to Kill Nazis. So I'm very excited to do
I love being one of the first as well.
that. Yeah, you are the first. So,
That's a rarity.
well, hey,
but
you jumped on it and you jumped on reading the book from Clash. So I appreciate that. I know, it's easy to say like everybody loves stuff about killing Nazis, but I really hope people will support this book, because I would love to do that. It's got a perfect setup for for sequels and prequels and like I would love Noah, the main character of the book. I would love to do Noah and mummies and Noah and like the French Resistance in a haunted house, or I've got all kinds of ideas, but the book has to sell first.
That's the wonders of using a vampire as your character.
Well, there's you got to finish the book, but there's more. Count Ryder has more adventures than just this one.
Perfect. Awesome. Where can people find you if you'd like to be found?
Yeah, so they can find me a couple different places. I'm on Twitter as at D Agranoff, Agranoff author. Well, it's not Twitter anymore; it's X, right?
Whatever it's called now, it'd be called
Yeah.
Duck next week, I don't know.
You can search my name on Facebook. I accept most friend requests, and that's probably where I'm most active. Instagram as Count Agranoff, Count.Agranoff. And you can find I do a podcast myself called Postcards from a Dying World. And it's basically I do whatever I want. I interview astronomers, punk rockers, authors. I did a whole series on 1930s science fiction that I'm very proud of on Postcards with panels. We break down every season of Star Trek on my podcast because I'm a big Trek nerd. I just recorded one of those yesterday. So, and sometimes Star Wars, sometimes fun stuff, but we're going to be doing. We did a whole series for Last Night to Kill Nazis on World War II mission novels. So we did an episode on The Dirty Dozen, Cross of Iron, Army of Shadows, Guns of Navarone, Force 10 from Navarone. So that's up there. And if you want to listen to the Dickheads podcast, the best place, we have our YouTube channel for Dickheads at YouTube at Dickheads Podcast, and SoundCloud. We have a SoundCloud up for Dickheads Podcast that has all the episodes. On Apple Podcasts, they really thought we were a penis podcast for some reason. So we're on Apple as PKD Heads, and the bonus episodes for Dickheads is a separate page on Apple. So it's PKD Heads bonus episodes. So we do a lot of like bonus interviews and panels and Dick adjacent other authors, and so you gotta go to both feeds for that. But they're all on the SoundCloud, they're all on the YouTube. And so if you want more Phillip K Dick, and if you want to hear me yammer on about Phil, that's the place to do it. And we're almost done. We just recorded the episode on the last book he wrote before he died. But we have about a dozen to go because after his death, most of his mainstream novels got published. So it'll be an interesting, weird thing because we're reading a lot of his non-science fiction books over the last period. It might be anticlimactic. I don't know. But we're getting into the final stages. And so you can also, one of the things that's fun about that is you can see our journey. You can see when we didn't know as much about Phil compared to when we're like know-it-alls now. The whole journey is there. So if you start from the beginning and read with us, and I actually, I think reading in publication order is the way to go with Phil, because you can really like see his life unfold if you want to read all of it. I don't necessarily recommend that everybody read all 44 novels, but there's definitely ones I did not like. So yeah.
There's always going to be one, isn't there?
Well, there's one that we beat up on all the time, and that's he wrote his fifth novel, Cosmic Puppets. We absolutely hated, and so to the point where we had one listener who stopped listening to us because he hated how much we bashed Cosmic Puppets. And he said in the comments, he's like, "Enough with Cosmic Puppets, you're haters," and because we really hated that book. And never shut up about it. We bring it up all the time. Well, like it's like a thing of saying, like, is it Cosmic Puppets bad? And but Phil hated that book, by the way, too. He was not he actually didn't want to put it back in print. So
It's basically what we do about Grave Encounters 2 on our film podcast. So that's an ongoing one. We hate that film.
there you
Cool.
go. See, yeah, yeah. But no, and Mark, I really appreciate very thoughtful questions. This book is a labor of love. It was really lightning fast from idea to fruition. And one thing I do want to put a shout out to Lisa and Christoph at Clash. They really believed in this book. Christoph, from the beginning, from the moment I told him the title, like, his first reply to me was, "Well, if you can pull off this book, you've got a home." And
Perfect.
yeah, he was very supportive from the beginning.
Thank you to David for coming on the podcast this week. Go and pick up a copy of The Last Night to Kill Nazis, and go and check out both the podcasts as well. Ours are listening for the Dickheads podcast as well. So something to jump into if you like our podcast and you love reading like we do. It's going to be an interesting podcast to listen to as well. As always, a huge shout out to our sponsor as well, Abominable Book Club. They're the UK's best and biggest horror and thriller book box service, bringing the wonders of a haunted bookshop straight to your door each month. You can either get the Bare Bones box, which is great. We love books. Books are awesome. But you could also get the Full Guts box as well, which is a brand new book, a possibly haunted second-hand book, and another indie title in there as well. You can also get snacks, UK snacks, drinks, get badges, you get bookmarks, you can get. I go on about this one. It's too much because only ever got this once. But the canvas bag that they gave a couple of months back, it's amazing. Love it. Carry it everywhere with me.
I
But
want one.
it's a really good one. It's coffee from the Black Lagoon. I love it. It's absolutely amazing. Head over to their website. It's Bottom of Book Club at cratejoy.com. It's in the description below. As always, they've been sponsoring us for the last 3 years. We've come up to 3 years on the podcast, and they've been on the podcast since way before that, when they were doing Snakebite Horrorcast back in the day. So go and use the code Bloody Goodreads at checkout. You get 10% off your box next time as well. So go and check it out. It's my most wanted thing each month. If I don't get it each month, I'll just go mad. So go and check it out, and go check out some of our Instagram posts where we have shown you some of the inserts of the box as well. As always, you can follow me over on Twitter or X or Duck or Goose, whatever they want to call it nowadays, at Bloody Goodreads, Instagram at Bloody Goodreads, and you can also check out some reviews over at bloodygoodreads.co.uk, which is our website over there. Kira does some amazing reviews. She bashes out reviews like nobody's business. She's quicker than I can actually even post them. So go and check them out. We've got some amazing coverage of Fright Fest as well, and some reviews from there coming up. And also check out our sister podcast, which is Bloody Good Screens Movie Club, which myself, Niall, Marcus, and Chloe review films. Most of them are bad, just to see if we can find our bloody good reads, or if they're going straight to the bin. And as always, huge thank you for listening to the podcast. If it wasn't for you guys, we wouldn't be here. 3 years in, coming up to 100 episodes as well, which we've got something quite exciting planned up, talking about some splatter horror with Kira as well. So look out for that episode when it does come out. And go give us a like, a share, and subscribe wherever you listen to your podcasts. As always, I have been your host, Mike Goddard, and I'll see you next time.